Greetings, friends. Welcome to this live stream for Empty Cloud Monastery. I'd like to begin as usual by paying homage to our teacher, the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I picked a topic for today, friends, which is the Buddha's practice. It's actually a really huge topic. I was looking at Majjhima Nikaya 121, the Chula Sunyata Sutta, the shorter sutta on emptiness. And I thought I'd speak about this, but then I was watching Venerable Vada a couple of months ago giving a wonderful talk about this very same sutta. So I started looking at all the different places in the suttas where the Buddha speaks about his practices before he became the Buddha as a bodhisattva. And I think there's just so much there for us. And I often find that the Buddha's biographical details that he gave so generously in the course of his life of teaching are so applicable for each one of us. You know, he struggled with the very same things, or many of the kind of kilesa, the defilements that we may face. And he probably had actually a lot less struggles than we do, because he'd been preparing himself, as we're told, for countless lifetimes to be born as the bodhisattva. He had you could say a head start karmically, but nevertheless, even in his life as the bodhisattva, his last life, the life in which he became the Buddha, he woke up. He had many, many challenges, and he was so generous in his sharing of the details of his practices. And so we can really learn so much about how to practice ourselves and learn from, in a way, his mistakes and the ways in which he refined his practice over time. When he shared the teachings on this process, it gave us the opportunity to, avoid certain pitfalls and wasting our time in fruitless practices, as the Bodhisattva did. So I think I'll talk a little bit about the process that led to the Bodhisattva becoming the Buddha, waking up, becoming fully liberated. And then I will touch on how he practiced from that time on. What was the way in which a Buddha would meditate? So first of all, we can remember how the Buddha spoke eloquently about his process of becoming disillusioned with samsara, how he woke up through becoming aware of, the reality of old age, sickness, and death as a young man, and what an impact that had on his mind, on his heart, and how also he saw a wandering mendicant, and that had a very profound effect on him too, to see someone who was searching for the way out of suffering and not participating in the daily round of pleasure and pain. And so the Buddha woke up to this extent as a young man. He felt he couldn't continue the household life, didn't he? And he went forth. He left everything that he knew, everything that was familiar to him, and stepped into the unknown. And the Buddha's particular story is that he fled his home his family, his child, his wife, in the dead of night. And it's quite touching, really, to consider what that would have been like. Perhaps how difficult it was for him to leave at that point. He wasn't free from attachments at that point. He was in love with his wife, and he just had a newborn baby, so profoundly connected to his life up until this 28 years of age. And he made a break, and the way he did it was to literally up and leave in the night, with one person helping him on a horse for some time. He crossed over a bridge, I think, and found himself in territory that he wasn't familiar with, at which point he got rid of the horse, he let go of his clothes, everything that he had from his previous life, and stepped completely into the unknown and putting on rags that he found. He took up the life of a wandering mendicant. So this was his first practice of renunciation, and big letting go, the big letting go that everyone who's gone forth into the monastic life has a sense of, or an experience of. And this is just the beginning, of course. And it's not only that we have to make this step, becoming monastics, but the beginning of the path is the willingness to, look squarely at the world with a degree of wisdom, survey the scene, look at the situation we're in, and to come to a point where there's a sense of nibbida coming in, or kind of weariness of the world. And we can all appreciate this arising. I was quite young. I think it was about 5 or 6 when I personally kind of really became aware of death. And it wasn't through losing a family member, funnily enough. It was through a song back in the 60s, song Seasons in the Sun, which I loved, the music. And then I started listening to the lyrics, and it's about a man who's dying, and he's saying goodbye to his sweetheart and goodbye to the beautiful spring weather. It's a very poignant song. And it really, because I loved music as a child, I listened intently to this over and over again, and it just went right in for me, into my heart, and shook me to the core to contemplate as a child that death is imminent for all of us, that we're all going to have to face this one. And so for all of us, that relationship with old age, sickness and death comes about in different ways. We may ignore, we may just want to deal with that when it comes. That is to kind of deny the reality of our situation to a greater or lesser extent. Or we may want to pursue the awful sense of insecurity and stress and pain that it can bring in for us when we really start to face the dukkha there, and notice our attachment to life and to health and to youth. Because actually old age, sickness and death are not in and of themselves suffering. It's our wish for them not to be happening, or our difficulty appreciating, accepting the naturalness, the normality of the cycles of birth and death. When we are shocked or upset by old age, sickness and death, we get the chance to begin to become aware of our problem, which is our attachment to this sense of self, to this one, or to those around us who we love. So it brings to the fore the fetters for us. So the Buddha had his experience at 28, we're told. He left the household life, and so his search began. And he was actually looking for teachers, wasn't he, at first? He was seeking help and support from wise sages around him. And he came across 2 great teachers who taught him the Arupa jhana. So very, wasn't it, ways in which he could really focus his mind, still his mind, very high attainments in terms of peace and well-being in samsara, the mind that is still, the mind that is free from the body, free from thinking, and the insights that he could experience, infinite space, infinite consciousness. He worked to the extent of letting go of all of that, experiencing nothingness, letting go of that, and experiencing neither perception or non-perception, these extremely refined states of bliss, beyond bliss, states of great stillness, great peace, great insight. And the Buddha, was able to achieve this. Many couldn't. Many who were striving in the same way were unable to attain these jhana. But the Buddha was able to attain them. And, the teachers wanted him to become their teacher. One of them wanted him to become their co-teacher. And the Buddha was not enticed by this situation of having attained great meditative attainments, envied by everyone around him, all the spiritual seekers around him. He knew that this wasn't the way out of suffering, because when he emerged from these attainments, he was still aware of suffering in the heart. So he walked away from all of that, these spiritual communities that he'd become part of, and continued his search. And he then veered from the sublime, the heavenly, the best that we can experience in samsara. He then inclined to seeking out ways to mortify the body and mind, to see whether that would help to rid him of his obsessions, his desire, his aversion. He went to the completely other end of the spectrum of practices available at the time, and he started to pursue the practice of letting go of supports for the body and mind. So fasting to extreme degrees, and fasting, letting himself do without the breath as much as possible. Actually, it's interesting to note that the Buddha didn't get into the practices of the day, and even to this day, of torturing the body kind of by bringing in ways of hurting and harming the body through instruments, implements, whipping the body, lying on nails, beds of nails. He didn't, hold up an arm or a leg so that it would wither away and become useless to torture the body. He didn't do anything. The word that comes to my mind is like artificial. He didn't bring in any extra practices. He just did without all that he could: food, water, sleep, comfort, physical comfort, and breath. And all of these practices were quite torturous for him. And for years he strove in this way, didn't he? And companions also were striving with him. And what happened, he got to the point of realizing this wasn't helping at all. This wasn't getting him any closer to freedom from suffering. He was still subject to turmoil, to mental distress, to desire aversion, restlessness, and doubt. He hadn't found the way. So, we can really learn from this what not to do, how not to practice. This is very helpful. And if we have experience of jhana, how there are limits to the use of such states, not to overindulge in practicing jhana, because this is not a way to purify the heart. The jhana are extremely helpful in terms of insight, in terms of giving ourselves peace and stillness. But in that place of jhana, in that space, in those times when we're immersed in jhana, we're not actually making any progress on the path. And that is important to recognize. And so the Buddha's taught us what not to do, or where not to spend our time and energy, through his own process of going from one extreme to another here. Then he began to practice in different ways. I think I'd like to share with you, I found some really interesting extracts from the suttas, which describe one in Brahmavara Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 4. The Buddha was practicing in forests, and he was describing how it was for him as the Bodhisattva to be practicing in the wilderness. This is one place where the Buddha tells us how he had to work with the defilements. In this case, the defilement was that of fear, of terror. And he said, he would dwell in such awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes as orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines. These places don't sound so horrifying to us, perhaps, friends, but people in the time, even now actually in Southeast Asia, people would avoid at all costs spending time, particularly at night, in burial grounds or cremation sites. Such places are considered to be very dangerous because there are spirits there. Also in the jungle, in the forest, it's considered to be very dangerous and terrifying because there are wild animals there that could kill you. And so people will tend to avoid such places. And at the time of the Buddha, there were far more forests, and people wanted to cultivate the land and to be safe in their fields, their farms, their villages, not to go into the forest for any reason unless you absolutely had to. And so the Buddha was seeking out these forbidden zones in order to face the defilements that arose for him in such terrifying places. He says in Majjhima 4, he says, while I dwelt there in the forests, in the shrine areas, a wild animal would come up to me, or a peacock would knock off a branch, or the wind would rustle the leaves. I thought, what now if this fear and dread is coming up in me? Why do I dwell expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread while keeping the same posture that I'm in when it comes upon me? So he walked, the fear and dread came upon him. He says, I neither stood nor sat nor lay down till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I stood, so whatever posture he was in, he maintained that posture. He didn't run away. He didn't try to move out of that posture until he had subdued the fear and dread that had arisen in him. Actually, Ajahn Chah spoke about the very same way of practice that he took up as a young monk, Tudong monk, wandering around in the countryside in Thailand. He would go to the forests and he would go to the cremation grounds, and he would spend nights there in such places. And the very same thing happened for him. He experienced extreme terror, petrified. He bled blood once. He urinated blood once, and he put that down to the extreme terror and stress that he experienced in his body and mind in these places. And he did exactly the same as the Buddha. He maintained his posture. He wouldn't move. If he was sitting meditating and he heard noises, he would just stay there and continue to practice. And the same if he was walking, lying down or standing. So this is quite a powerful practice. And here the Buddha in Brahmavara Sutta is really sharing with us his vulnerability, just as we have until we don't, to fear, to terror, to the fear that something terrible might happen to this body. The Buddha also, there's another sutta, Majjhima 128, friends, Upakilesa Sutta. The Buddha here is speaking about his striving to overcome the defilements. And in this sutta, he speaks about doubt. He was subject to doubt. He was subject to loss of focus, dullness and drowsiness, fear, elation, discomfort, excessive energy, not enough energy, longing, perceptions of diversity, that is the wild mind that won't shut up, that won't become tame so easily, excessive concentration on forms, obsessing about thoughts, memories perhaps, unable to overcome that so easily. So the Buddha, as the Bodhisattva, had to sit through all these mind states, had to struggle just as we may struggle in our meditation practice, to, have to watch the endless movie playing out, the repetitive thoughts, the obsessive thoughts, the restless body, the sleepiness, the drowsiness, the resistance, all of it. He went through the very same struggles that we may face. And he worked with all of these defilements through, patient endurance and the willingness to bring up bright states, the willingness to face the hindrances and to allow them, to arise and pass away without making a problem about them or without getting caught up in them, in just the same way that we may find ourselves practicing. The Buddha also worked with the mind in different ways. And I spoke the other day from Majjhima 19. I spoke about Majjhima 19, Dveda Vitakka Sutta. There are two kinds of thought. The Buddha, at one point in his striving, he recognized there are simply two kinds of thought that can be experienced, the wholesome and the unwholesome. That which leads to peace and well-being and purification of the heart, and that which leads away from freedom. And he then, from that point on, divided up his thoughts. So he was watching the mind and categorizing the thoughts. And he gave us this as a practice in this beautiful sutta, Majjhima 19, to try this, to first of all be willing to, or train ourselves to step away from thinking as me and mine, step away from being immersed in thinking and to scrutinize this whole process. And once we take this standpoint of observing the thinking, we can then begin to do this work of categorizing our thoughts. And of course, in this categorization, we can note that unskillful thoughts, thoughts that lead away from peace and well-being, thoughts that are tinged with ignorance, tinged with greed, hatred, or delusion, such thoughts are to be dealt with great caution. We have to be very alert, very vigilant with such thoughts. And he gave the simile of the cowherder. Someone was asking me last week about this cowherding, the cowherding similes that I mentioned when speaking about this sutta. The Buddha said, when the thoughts are unwholesome, we have to be like a cowherder in the rainy season when the crops are growing and the cows have to be kept away from the crops. You have to be vigilant, keep an eye on each and every one of the cattle and make sure that they don't stray onto those crops, or there will be big trouble for that cowherder. When the thoughts are wholesome, on the other hand, thoughts that incline us towards renunciation, towards practice, towards letting go, towards virtue, then such thoughts can be given a bit of leeway, just like the cowherder at the end of the harvest, when the crops have all come in and the fields are bare and it doesn't really matter where the cattle go. They can't do any damage or can't get into any trouble. And so the cowherder can sit and just relaxedly watch the cattle from a distance, make sure they don't go too far away. So in this way, we can learn so much from this teaching of the Buddha, how to work with our thoughts, or the thoughts, the train of thoughts that's playing out when we start to observe thinking. So all these ways the Buddha gave us, and all this experience he shared with us of his own struggles. And then the point came at the end of 6 years from the time that he left his home and was indulging, or not indulging, but taking part in and practicing very severe austerities. At the end of 6 years, he had a kind of breakthrough. We don't know exactly how it was for him, but the way he describes it is there was an appreciation that this wasn't working. And with this appreciation that he was wasting his time, he hadn't managed yet to do the right kind of practice for liberation. The same time as this came to him, he had a memory come up of the time when he was a young child, 5 or 6, and he was sitting out under a rosewood tree. You get this beautiful image of this boy sitting under the tree while his father is off in the distance, ploughing, farming with the rest of the adults. And this little boy sat down under a tree and he started to meditate. I'd like to read you from Majjhima 100. Beautiful account, Sangharavara Sutta. The Buddha gives an account of what happened at that time. This memory came up, and this is what he remembered. He said, I recall sitting in the cool shade of the rose apple tree while my father, the Sakyan, was off working. Quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, I entered and remained in the first absorption, the first jhana, which has the rapture and bliss born of seclusion, while placing the mind and keeping it connected. Could that be the path to awakening? Stemming from that memory came the realization that is the path to awakening. It occurred to me, why am I afraid of that pleasure? For it has nothing to do with sensual pleasures or unskillful qualities. I thought, I'm not afraid of that pleasure. It has nothing to do with sense pleasures or unskillful qualities. And so then he stopped his ascetic practices. He began to look after his body and gain some strength because he was so emaciated, so close to death. Through the fasting, extreme fasting that he'd been doing. So first he built himself up, received food, alms food, again ate healthily, gained strength, and he started to practice in just this way that he had been practicing as a child. And he started to practice the jhana again, but in a very different way from before. He had sought out teachers and taken up their methods and attained the higher jhana. When he had this memory of childhood, it was a very different experience. I can only imagine, as I'm sure you too can. It was natural. He was relaxing. He was able to have suitable conditions in that moment as a child, nobody disturbing him, no impingement from outside, and he could enter into and feel out what was happening for him in his mind and body. And the result, a child with a peaceful mind, with a mind free from remorse and agitation, he could simply be present. And, the unfolding then of the stilling of the mind, the mind entering into great bliss, well-being, bodily and physical, just sitting and relaxing in that way. And his mind was free from any kind of persistent thinking. The thinking could fall away, and he was able to focus on the object, the breath. I think in this case he was watching the breath. Whatever the object may be for us, we can benefit so much, can't we, from practicing in this way? We choose an object from meditation practice and we focus on that, and immediately the mind can start to become quiet, stiller, more peaceful. And if we continue to practice Anapanasati, observing the breath or observing the body, different aspects of the body, or even a kasina, an object or a color, just choosing an object and staying with that object, the mind will inevitably, eventually begin to calm down. If we have the right conditions in place, that is a peaceful place to practice, and a heart that's free from remorse through practicing virtue, keeping precepts. If we have these stable foundations, then the mind will incline towards stillness and peacefulness. And so the child experienced the first jhana. And when the Bodhisattva began to relax again, stop striving, stop artificially creating either very pleasant or painful conditions, just be with what is, he began to experience the peaceful states. First jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. Waves of bliss, waves of rapture. That peace and that bliss and rapture becomes something of a disturbance as the mind becomes more peaceful. That becomes a source of agitation. Even that is too much. The mind inclines to greater stillness, and so those states fall away. And what is left is equanimity, beautiful stillness, nothing moving. And this, at this point, the Buddha recognized that he had a place of practice, a way of practice that he could stand on to give the mind enough clarity, enough lucidity to be able to turn his investigation towards the defilements and to see them as they arose and passed away, and so to begin to purify the heart. And when the Buddha got this, when he began to investigate the Dharma in this way, from this perspective of a peaceful enough, focused enough mind, still in the body, still able to appreciate feelings in the body, the breath, to be not stepping away altogether from this physical embodied experience, he could begin to root out the defilements, and he was able to progress extremely quickly, so that once he'd gained his health and he's meditating peacefully, going along with the flow of nature, observing the body and mind, noticing the arising of the unwholesome and letting go, he very quickly attained full liberation. He came to the end of the upswelling of the asava, of the causes of suffering. The root defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion were seen through. And when he became the Buddha, he knew he was free. He knew that that process came to an end, and he was able to experience Nibbana in an unbroken, clear, full way. He also attained the other two of the three knowledges. The knowledge of the end of suffering was there for him. He attained the knowledge of all his past lives, and he also attained the knowledge of seeing how all beings arise and pass according to karma, according to cause and effect. And he could see all the playing out of this drama. He could see the full picture as a Buddha. So he had these Tewija, these three knowledges. This he attained in one night, this breakthrough to become the Buddha. Happened, of course, as we know, under the Bodhi tree in one night, the full moon of May. And from that time on, the Buddha was still 45 more years of human life ahead of him. He was still alive, he was practicing, he was teaching. His main practice as the Buddha, I would say, was the practice of teaching the Dhamma. This was his full-time role. He was tireless, from what we can gather, in teaching and wandering huge distances to meet huge numbers of people and convey the insights that he had gained and to convey the possibility of path to others. So, the Buddha was serving, essentially, as the Buddha. That was his main practice: speaking, listening, teaching, meeting people, making himself available for others. But also he had a meditation practice, and it is very fascinating to discover from the suttas that the Buddha had practices that he most often engaged with when he was able to, when he was free, when he was alone, when he could be out in nature. And this sutta that I wanted to share a little of with you, Majjhima 121, 121, Shula Sunyata Sutta, is an incredible exposition from the Buddha, speaking about his practice and how also we can consider practicing in a similar way wherever we are on the path. There is this possibility for us. So Ananda is actually asking the Buddha in this sutta, I've heard, he said, that you usually practice, I think you said once, that you practice emptiness. That is your practice that you most often abide in. Is that the case? And the Buddha said to Ananda, yes, indeed it is. This is the practice that I most often resort to. And so then he gives a teaching on this practice of emptiness. And as a Buddha, he could take this practice to its end, which is the signless meditation. And I'm just going to find you where the Buddha speaks about, I think I'll actually go through the sutta in order, in fact, because he explains, what is this concept of emptiness and how can we cultivate this in our practice. So I find this a very helpful way to consider, friends, our meditation, and also as a contemplation that we can bring into our lives, what it is, this concept of emptiness, and how we can apply it. First of all, the Buddha, speaking to Ananda, says, consider where we are right now. They were in a stilt longhouse, a wooden building belonging to a person called Megara's mother. And in the building, there were monastics. So other people, but only monastics. The Buddha said, consider, in this building, in this longhouse, the absence of elephants, the absence of cows, horses and mares, of gold and silver, and of gatherings of laymen or lay women. He said, this place is empty of those things, and we can consider that. So as a preliminary sunyata, emptiness practice, friends, it's very interesting to bring to mind what is not present. We may be sitting in a room, space of some sort. It will have certain things in it, but it is empty of so much else. And just to consider, for example, I'm sitting here in a quiet room at the end of a house in a quiet village. I'm away from the city. I'm away from traffic. There's no aeroplanes up in the sky above me. There's nobody drilling or chopping down trees, using power tools around me. This is a quiet place, and all these things are absent. It is empty of those things. And to just consider what is not unfolding at this moment in the way of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, and also thoughts, is immediately a way of us appreciating the degree of space and the degree of peacefulness that we may be experiencing right now, without sitting and meditating, without immersing in jhana, without any special conditions. Right now, what is there for us to experience of emptiness? And then when we begin to meditate, we can notice how we focus on an object. In this sutta, the Buddha speaks about earth element as a object of meditation. One can practice focusing one's attention on earth element in this body and outside of this body. It could be anything. We could pay attention to the breath. We could be sweeping the body with our awareness. We could be focusing on a candlelight. It could be anything at all. We could be staring at a blank wall. Whatever our object of meditation, we can notice everything else that's not present for us. And as we develop focus and attention deepens to our object of meditation, we can, in a way, reflect back on what is not happening for us at that time. This gives an incredible perspective. I find it an encouragement, and it's also an immediate broadening of the view, so that within that bigger picture, we can see the benefit of the meditation practice, and we can fully appreciate the peacefulness to whatever degree that is manifesting as a result of that focus. The Buddha goes on to describe, for those who practice, who experience jhana, how it is that for each jhana there is an experience of a falling away of the states that have led up to this degree of stillness and focus. And so we can experience ever deepening states of immersion in the jhana, and not at that point where we're actually immersed in the jhana, but after emerging from that peaceful state, we can reflect on what was not present there. And it's a way of seeing how much freedom has been experienced or is being experienced, how much has been let go of. We often fail to notice, friends, that aspect of our experience. One could say cessation, when things come to an end, when we are free from certain defilements or agitated states, when we're free of certain obsessions or desires, we tend to really not give any energy or attention to that degree of freedom that we're experiencing. It's a bit like a person who is very sick, in hospital, perhaps in some danger, perhaps in a lot of physical suffering or mental suffering or both. And fortunately, there's some treatment and there's a healing time can happen, recovery can happen, and that person can return to full health. How often, when healthy, one can very quickly forget all that went before. It's actually a bit of a conditioning that we have to want to look away from painful experiences, to forget about them as quickly as possible. And yet, when we are healthy and well, if we've ever been sick, if our life's ever been in danger, to look back and to really appreciate what has come before is actually a very helpful practice to fully appreciate and make much of the health that we're fortunate enough to be experiencing, knowing also having the added dimension of recognizing its fleeting nature, its flimsiness, its instability. This insight and the insight into how fortunate and how glad we can be that we have these good conditions at this point is an inspiration for us to continue to make much of, to make the most of our situation. In the very same way in our practice, when we can notice cessation, notice the freedom from disturbance, distraction, freedom from ignorance in all different ways as we become a little bit wiser on the path, looking back and reviewing and noting what has been let go of is so helpful for us to really give us encouragement to keep going on the path of practice, to see the emptiness here, the emptiness of anger in this moment, the emptiness of desire right now, the emptiness of agitation, remorse, and so forth. This is a really valuable practice for us. And so the Buddha in this sutta, Chula Sunyata Sutta, speaks of emptiness in every respect, like at every stage in the practice, there's the possibility of us contemplating sunyata, what is not present, and gaining much benefit from this practice. And I want to finish by speaking from an excerpt towards the end of this sutta, where the Buddha speaks about the ultimate peace and well-being that can be experienced in samsara, which are the higher jhana, and how from the 8th jhana, from the most sublime stillness and peace that we can experience in this heart and mind, then the Buddha's own practice is to let go of all of these states of focus, of stillness, to let go of the 8th jhana. And in letting go of the 8th jhana, to focus on the signless immersion of the heart. The signless immersion of the heart, there's absolutely nothing left that one could call an object of meditation or that one could call an experience, however subtle. Absolutely nothing left. This was the choice. This was the meditation of one who's awake, to dwell fully in the ultimate sunyata, the ultimate emptiness. There's absolutely nothing happening. And it's interesting that the Buddha says that here in this state, all that's left is the body and its 6 senses. I get the impression of, or the memory come to my mind of the ox herding pictures in the Zen tradition, how it is that we practice, we take ourselves away from the world, we experience all sorts of spiritual states of mind, attainments, the jhana, degrees of freedom from the defilements. We go through this process of path, And then at the end, when there's a breakthrough to liberation, there's no longer a struggle, the work has been done. What's left? There is this body with these 6 senses, but the relationship, when the ox herder comes back to the marketplace, we come back to the world, the relationship with this body and its 6 senses is utterly different. Our whole relationship with this form and these impingements through the sense doors is utterly devoid of any sense of self, of any possibility of reactivity, having a problem with, of identifying in any way with this experience. So it's very interesting that here in this sutta we have the full circle, the Buddha telling us how it is that we, even when and if a person becomes fully liberated, there is still this body, there are still these 6 senses. The Buddha had a body and he had the 6 senses, very sensitive, always impinged upon, just like all of us, by sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and thoughts. And yet, his dwelling place was the signless. He would dwell in the signless. He could let go of all the activity, of all the endless circling cycles of samsara, all of that energy playing out. He was able to look away from all of it and rest in the ultimate emptiness. We can't imagine that. It's impossible to put into words what that is, but the Buddha described it for us here as the signless immersion of the heart for us to contemplate. This is the meditation of a Buddha, one who's free from greed, hatred, and delusion, for whom there is no quivering in the heart, there's no movement, there's no self, there's no argument with reality. And the Buddha said, however, there is only this modicum of stress. This is for the Buddha. There is only this modicum of stress, namely that related to the 6 sense fields dependent on this body and conditioned by life. One can understand even this signless immersion of the heart is produced by choices and intentions, and understand whatever is produced by choices and intentions is impermanent and liable to cessation. Knowing and seeing this, the heart is freed from the defilements, sensuality of the desire to be reborn and of ignorance. Kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, these 3 faces of craving, of desire. Desire for sense pleasures, desire for becoming, desire for annihilation. One is freed from these, and when we're freed, we know we're freed. So this is a really beautiful encouragement and inspiration to see that every experience we can have of emptiness is conditioned. Let's remember, however much we experience peace, freedom from, cessation, there's always more to let go of. Notice that everything we can experience is conditioned due to cause and effect. And so to have the mind that is letting go, in letting go mode, so that all the most peaceful states we can experience are to be let go of until we can step beyond into that field, into that place the Buddha called nibbana, that which is cool, that which is free from knots, the indescribable, to know that the Buddha gave us all these meditations in Majjhima 121. And so we can take heart. We may not be free from all suffering, but we can still appreciate emptiness. And let your contemplation of emptiness speak to the heart and inspire the heart and encourage still further the good practice and the letting go that inexorably leads towards the ultimate peace of Nibbana. Ayya. Thank you for your wise attention, friends, and presence here on the live stream, those who are here. And thanks especially for those who've jotted down in the chat comments and greetings. Hi, Madeline. And Thai friends. I can't read Thai, but welcome. And Rebecca and Heike. Hi, Heike. And Heike's listening in from Ireland. Madeline, I think you're in the UK, aren't you? Hello, JD Smith. And Maria from Nova Scotia. Welcome. And Nim and Jody, thank you for putting your names down and your greetings, friends. I'm just going to see if there's any questions or reflections on this theme of emptiness. Oh, yes. Thank you, Madeline. Madeline's got a great piece of advice for us here. Super duper, because this is a wonderful suggestion. She says people might be interested in reading Venerable Analayo's excellent book, A Meditator's Guide to the Buddha. Thank you. Actually, all his books are incredible, aren't they? Really are. His book on Satipatthana Sutta is a remarkable text, which I remember using one winter retreat, and it was just the most helpful guide for my practice during those 3 months of retreat time. Big respect to Venerable Analayo. And Madeline says this book is based on the suttas and their Chinese counterparts. This book, particular book, A Meditator's Guide to the Buddha. Thanks, Madeline. I haven't actually read that book. I'm gonna read that book. Thank you. We've got a friend from Australia here. Greetings. And Rebecca has a comment. Yeah, that's great. No other questions, no other comments, except one from Heike. Okay, 2 more. Rebecca says, Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of Majjhima 4 says the Buddha subdued his fear. Bandhu Sujato says, got rid of. This implies a very active approach. Could you clarify this more? Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Very briefly, I mean, the Buddha was willing to stay with the fear rather than trying to in any way get away from it. And so to face that dukkha fully, to feel the terror in the body and in the mind. Well, when we, stay with an experience, we will always notice how that experience is changing. And it just takes that willingness to stay steady, patiently endure, and we will come to that point of noticing any kind of feeling, any kind of defilement, any kind of emotion will rise and pass. And we can start to notice that changeability, that it's not always at a peak. The terror is not always acute. It will come and go to some extent. There might even be moments when we're thinking of something completely different. A thought comes into the mind completely unrelated to the terrifying situation we're in, or some different feeling comes in. And so the willingness to stay steady, to stay still. In this case, the Buddha stayed in the same postures. The posture that he was in, he maintained that posture, and he just focused completely on the feeling of fear. And in investigating that, of course, insight can arise. How is it in the body? What's happening in the mind? We can start to appreciate when we explore and investigate any emotion, however intense, that it is something changeable, something that comes and goes, something that morphs into different nuances of emotion. And so it is that we start to open to the impermanent nature of all experience. I'm unable to speak for the Buddha's experience, but I can imagine from my own experience this kind of process happening. So the Buddha subdued his fear, or he got rid of his fear. What actually one could say is the Buddha was willing to face his fear and to see the anicca, anatta, dukkha nature of that fear, the painful nature of experience, the changeability, and the impersonal nature. So there's a body and mind reacting to a situation. We can see the cause and effect. We can begin to unpack any sense of self, any sense of identification with that fear, to begin to soften that, to see it changing. And so the fear moves through. The fear can do what fear will always do, which is change, which is cease at some point. So I think these beautiful translations, getting rid of, subduing, cannot necessarily fully encompass the process, but we can contemplate what that process might be and see what happens for us when we sit with emotions that are really hard to be with and willingly stay steady, stay still, and allow them to play out. Thanks, Rebecca. One more comment before we close, and that is from Heike. Oh, Madeline, you're in the UK, but you're Irish. Good to know. Same. Heike's in Ireland and you're German, right? But you're Irish now, Heike, sure. Okay, last comment is from Heike, and it is such a practical, applicable teaching. Freedom from and noticing what's not here right now. Thanks for finding these gems. Yeah, thank you, Heike. It's such a gem. Actually, there's so much there to really consider. I've really only touched on it. It's worth looking again at, or looking at Sutta 121, Chula Sunyata Sutta in Majjhima Nikaya, because it goes through all the possible ways in which we can have enough freedom to contemplate this degree of emptiness. And within that, there is this process of being able to recognize what's not here and how that can support our ability to continue to let go and to become more attentive to what is here. I feel there's so much more here, but not actually in the way of words, so much as for us to practice observing emptiness to whatever degree, and to really appreciate this quality in our experience. Thank you, friends. I'll finish here gratefully, and let's conclude by paying homage to our teacher, the Buddha, with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.